My name is David Monjo with Hydro International. I am a regional sales manager for the company, covering the northeastern part of the country. And today we're going to talk about with a focus on various pollutants that you might encounter in stormwater runoff and some of the treatment options that are available to target specific pollutants. You'll see as we go through that it isn't necessarily a one-for-one relationship in terms of using something specific, and generally speaking, with a variety of treatment options, most everything will capture a range of pollutants, but in varying degrees. So some options are better than others depending on your needs. So in terms of overview, I'll touch just briefly a little bit on Hydro International just to give you a bit of background, but primarily focus on various pollutant problems that you might encounter or be dealing with. Look at a range of solutions to deal with those various issues. And as we go through, for all intents and purposes, we're going to be looking at progressively greater levels of treatment. So a little bit of background, a little bit of overview. Background on the company, Hydro International. We are a company that operates to some degree in 33 countries around the world. We are actually headquartered in the UK. We have 2 offices in the UK, 2 in the United States, an office in the Middle East, and an office in Australia. And through those 6 offices are able to cover the countries you see highlighted on the map there. We've been in the US since 1986, so for over 30 years now, operating in the United States. In terms of capabilities, I'm based out of an office, our stormwater headquarters in Portland, Maine, so heavy focus on stormwater management. We also, out of an office in Portland, Oregon area, focus on wastewater treatment issues, combined sewer overflows, and also to get into other water treatment applications involved with industrial flood protection, primarily based on flow control devices and data monitoring and the like. So again, just a little bit of an overview. To date, as I mentioned earlier, over here in the States alone, over 30 years of experience installing BMPs throughout the country. At this point in time, we have thousands of separator and filter systems installed across the country and obviously the world. And in our stormwater headquarters here in Maine, we also have a world-class hydraulics lab installed where we're able to do a wide range of testing on existing products, potential new products, very high level of sophistication that we're able to accomplish. And quite honestly, there's rarely a day that there isn't some activity going on in the lab in our facility in terms of testing, some form of equipment or another. So as I go through here, I've got a few polls that I've decided to utilize to try to get a little input from the audience out there. So I'm going to start here with knowing that the focus today is on various pollutants. I wanted to ask the question of what type of pollutants you most commonly deal with. So as a result of that, I have launched a little poll that hopefully you're able to respond to, and looking for the single most common pollutant you tend to deal with on a regular basis, just to try to gauge, one, occurrence, but also, the nature of the problem that you're most often trying to accomplish. And, as we can see, I'll give you a few seconds and close it in a minute, but at the moment, pretty heavy on the sediment side. 75% of the problems, or 75% of the participants are telling me that, that's the most common thing that you're dealing with. At this point, I'm gonna close that poll, and I'll share the results with the rest of you. So you can see that heavily weighted towards sediment. Hopefully you're seeing all that. And then distant second at 13% are nutrients, followed by some other issues that are not uncommon either, metals and petroleum and trash, all in the 4 to 5% range. And quite honestly, from my perspective, and I imagine for most of you, not really a surprise that sediment would come up number one, because I think the vast majority of regulations around the country primarily target sediment or TSS as a major issue to deal with. So we'll talk a little bit about that as I go along. I'm going to start first by speaking about trash, and in terms of how I'm exploring some of these issues, really kind of taking it from perhaps the things that are larger in size, let's say, and in some cases more readily dealt with, to those that progressively get a little bit harder. So talk a little bit about trash. As I think we all know, trash is pretty much ubiquitous in the environment. You see trash everywhere, unfortunately. So it's a common issue. Sometimes it's not thought about because there is a fair amount of trash along roadways and the like, but obviously it's a regular issue. Some interesting statistics: 80% of the trash that is in water originates on land. Probably no great surprise there, since obviously mankind is the cause of that. The amount of trash that can be safely assimilated into an aquatic environment is 0. So the vast majority of trash is plastic, so it's not readily assimilated into a natural environment. And as a result, there's at least 3 places in the country, and I'm sure there are others, where there are TMDLs in place that call for no trash in the environment. So discharge locations are required to contain all trash. So as you can see, those 3 cities: LA, San Francisco, and Baltimore. Animals often mistake plastic for food, which obviously can create an issue. Up to 500 years for a single piece of plastic to decompose, and as I mentioned a moment ago, makes up a significant portion of the trash found in water is in fact plastic. So, and again, as I mentioned at the beginning, what I'm going to do is talk about the issues initially, and then we'll then look at solutions. Sediment, obviously this was a big one in terms of response. The vast majority of you deal with sediment on a routine basis. Some of the basic effects can cause drain lines, resulting in flooding. Obviously, it makes receiving water bodies muddy, or high levels of cloudiness in water. It's not uncommon after a big rain event that many rivers become quite murky just due to the runoff and the amount of sediment in that runoff. There are other pollutants that bind themselves to sediment. Metals are one. Nutrients, often the same, which have other adverse effects in terms of removing oxygen from the aquatic ecosystems. So, significant issue. And in fact, in the same way that, so many of you said this is a routine problem that you deal with, sediment is in fact considered to be the most common pollutant that is caused by or is a result of stormwater runoff. Metals, looking a little further at metals, the variety of causes, certainly the most impactful, perhaps, from industrial operations or mining activities, where you can see significant impacts from metal pollution, resulting in impacts to receiving water bodies, but also, other more seemingly benign ways they're introduced, such as brake linings from cars and the like, things like guardrails that introduce a level of heavy metals into the environment, zinc and the like. So, from a variety of sources. And oftentimes the combination of those, of a variety of metals, can create truly toxic situations for ecosystems as well as people. So obviously there's an impact from this. And then lastly, nutrient problems. This was the second one in the poll, and certainly there are a number of regulations that work to target issues associated with nutrients. Some of the most common, algae growth is certainly a major result of nutrient introduction into water systems, results in the depletion of oxygen, suffocating fish, releasing toxins as a result. Can even affect blood chemistry, if it is an impact in drinking water. So, again, some of the issues we're dealing with, we'll look a little more specifically now at some of the approaches. Another question for you: what is the primary reason for requiring treatment? And a little bit of explanation. Development regulations / permitting. What I'm driving at here is, when you look to apply some form of treatment, are you attempting to address, a specific aspect of a regulation that tells you have to do so? So that would be option number one. Or number two, a specific pollutant problem, right? There is a specific issue. An industrial site might be an example of this, where perhaps there's something in the runoff originating from there. And then lastly, in some cases, it's just the right thing to do. So I've got another poll here for you, and I will launch this one and take a few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, to, I shouldn't say a few minutes, we'll say a few seconds, to give me your thoughts on that particular poll, and then we can discuss the results of that. So, all right, that's probably good. Looks like the numbers aren't much changing there. So I will share those results with all of you, and the vast majority of you, really what you're trying to deal with is a regulatory issue. Where specifically you're prescribed to put in place some form of treatment. In most cases, I imagine, for the purposes of permitting, you're trying to help a client get his site permitted, and there's certain requirements you have to meet. I'm pleased to see that, in fact, coming in second is it's the right thing to do. As I put this poll together and debated whether to throw that option in there, I thought, well, there might not be a lot of answers to that question, but in fact, 10% of you are dealing with situations where, as I would put it, there's just an issue to deal with, and you're looking to address it. And then lastly, specific pollutant problems. So, there perhaps again, it's a little more specific that you've got an issue to address. I've got a last one. It's sort of a follow-on to the last question. The question is whether or not, or in terms of your regulations, do they require the use of pre-approved treatment choices, or do they allow for flexible treatment options? Now, I know for most of you there's a bit of a gray area here, but what I'm driving at as much as anything else is that there are some regulatory areas where the only thing you're allowed to use is what's spelled out perhaps in a stormwater handbook, or there's some level of pre-approval that has to take place to make an option available to you, whereas other areas, they're a little more open-minded, shall we say, and sometimes it's about presenting the best option in terms of how you need to deal with your issue. So that's the kind of thought process I'm driving at in this particular one. So, all right. Still see this one. We look pretty static. I'm going to close this one and share this with you as well. And it's fairly interesting, as hopefully you can all see. The results are very evenly split, 51 to 49, and even as you were tracking your results, at one time it was 50-50. So yeah, interestingly, there's a pretty even distribution here in terms of what options you have available to you. I bring this up as much as any other reason because, now as I take this presentation to another area and look at treatment options, I recognize the fact that in some locations, you may be limited in your choices to devices that are pre-approved in some way. In other places, you can use a fair amount of flexibility. So while I think much of what I have to say applies to some degree across the country, there may be times where you're a little bit more limited in your options available to you. But just wanted to point out, that is something that can come into play. So as I look a little closer at treatment systems, highlighting in general, oh, am I still sharing? Gotcha. Let me shut this down here because we don't all need to see this. Okay, there we go. In terms of treatment options, I'm gonna, in all that I have to talk about over the next, the remainder of the presentation, there'll certainly be a heavy emphasis on sediment, and for good reason, because, going back to that earlier poll, it's the most common thing heavily that folks have to deal with. So if we look at the range of gradations of sediment, and in terms of what you may need to target, there are different choices available to you. And so, as I said earlier, to a certain degree, if you look at the choices available in terms of treatment, all target quite a range of types of pollutants, but some are a little stronger than others depending on the specific need. So I'm going to start initially by talking about screening devices and then go from there to look a little more fully at separator devices, primarily Vortex based, and then finally into filtration. As you can see by the chart, each of those get progressively greater levels of sediment removal in terms of particle size. So starting initially with screens, really where screens come into play is where the main focus is on larger debris or even organic matter or trash that may be in your runoff. In terms of its most basic level as a sediment removal device, they tend to be baffle box based and then use screens to augment the separation of the solids. So baffle box allows for settling and removal of primarily coarse sediment, while the screens focus on removing debris and trash and the like. Some points worth making is that, ideal screen design, really what we're looking to do is to try to keep the screenings dry. What we've captured in the screens, keep it dry so that it doesn't sit in the water and potentially leach other pollutants into the runoff. These systems can be used as standalone in some cases where, perhaps it's at a discharge point or even as a part of a treatment train. Certainly one of the big advantages they have is that they can often be sized to treat very large flow rates. So, a good example where you might see a device of this nature used is perhaps you've got a municipal roadway, an existing outfall that's discharging untreated. A device of this nature could greatly improve that discharge. Oftentimes because the sediment removal rates are a little coarser than other options available to you. If the focus is exclusively TSS, then they aren't necessarily your best choice. But again, if you've got a large outfall into a water body and there's a known, the known existence of trash and debris and things of this nature, then screenings make for a good option. Some things to look for in terms of design of screening devices, the size of the screen, number one, and I'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. How flow is distributed through the structure in terms of its ability to use the available screen surface, the size of the open area and the potential for blinding. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, looking to keep organic debris dry so that it doesn't release, primarily other nutrients back into the water. The most common example here is in areas where, perhaps there's a lot of leaf debris and things of that nature. If those leaves are allowed to collect, nutrients will, leach readily right into your flow stream, much like a tea bag sitting in a cup. So the idea would be to try to keep that organic matter above the standing water in order to prevent that from happening. And then certainly to help them protect from, ragging and things of that nature. So large screen area is very important. We make a device called a DryScreen where, very much the entire surface area of the vault is covered by a screen. It allows for screening areas up to 3 times larger than other competitive devices we see in the marketplace. The larger the screen area, the longer that system will operate before the potential for plugging and the need for it to be cleaned. Splitting of the flow stream, in a very simple manner, if the flow is allowed to move straight across the box, the likelihood is only a small portion of the screen might actually be used, again, resulting in the potential for the screen to become blinded. So our system actually operates where we split the flow stream and therefore better distribute it across the entire surface of the screen, resulting in a little additional longevity. Open screen area, extremely important that area be greater than the area associated with your pipes in and out of the system. Again, by the simple fact we've got a screen area that more or less covers the entire surface area of the vault, we're looking at open area that's in the range of 4 times or so what a typical pipe diameter is. So again, one of the goals here is to prevent plugging. And as I mentioned, the screen in our particular system is actually sits above the standing water level. So as a storm event subsides and the water drains down in the vessel, the debris is actually left to rest above the standing water level, so there is no, long-term leaching of material into the water. And then lastly, the need to avoid any type of textured screens in order to, prevent any kind of ragging that might exist. Obviously, we're looking to prevent too much buildup on the screen in any one particular area. So all functions that, we, have designed into our particular screening device. Now, taking a further step along, we start to look at other more advanced separation techniques. And, here's an area where, as we look specifically at the fact that many regulations are geared toward TSS removal, and then also separately that many areas actually have, requirements for pre-approved devices. The next two separator systems I'm going to show you, lend themselves heavily to these kind of applications. We have a long history as a company in the development of vortex separation, where there are cylindrical vessels that use a rotational flow in order to enhance the separation of solids from the water. And thereby, we're able to improve performance and do it in a relatively small footprint, rather than simply relying on gravity and the settling velocity of the solids out of the water. So just some simple examples of, how we've used vortex technology over the years for flow control purposes, for stormwater treatment applications, and likewise for combined sewer overflow discharges and even wastewater treatment applications too, for where devices are used in the headworks of treatment plants. So heavy reliance and development of vortex separation technology in our company. I'm going to start by talking about a device known as the First Offense. It is naturally a vortex-based device. The way that it operates is that the components within the device actually generate the rotational flow in the sump in order to get our separation. And importantly, the components create an internal bypass within the device. There's actually two weirs that allow higher flows to bypass internally around the center shaft of the device. That central shaft is used for clean out, that allows access into the sump. So, when we look at the First Defense unit, here we're targeting finer particles that you might see removed through a baffle box or a screening device. Big advantages, while the device has been shown, through independent testing to get removal at very high treatment flow rates, given their size. They're also capable of passing high peak flows, primarily due to the fact that there's an internal bypass. So there's less of a concern for those higher flows. And really what that lends itself to is design flexibility. One of the nice advantages of a device like the First Defense with an internal bypass is that, to a strong extent, you can use the device or design with it almost like a standard manhole. There are some limitations, but by and large, you can very much design with it much the way you would a standard manhole. So, some of the advantages, reasons for specifying a unit, site flexibility, and again, I'll talk about all these in a little more detail. Site flexibility, this goes directly to what I just mentioned about almost having the ability to treat it like a standard drain manhole. I mentioned high flow for the size of the footprint. We have taken the device through a number of verification agencies. So I can't claim, all the states or locations, but for a large number of areas that in the country where there is a need for pre-approval, the First Defense is often approved device. Installation is very simple and straightforward, not much more difficult than any standard manhole. And then likewise, the maintenance is designed to be quite easy and inexpensive as well. So I mentioned design flexibility. Looking at the device from above, these are weirs that you see here. This shaft is how we get a hose from a Vector truck into the sump for clean out, and these two weirs that you see on either side create our bypass. So we're able to bring inlet pipes in anywhere around the perimeter of the manhole as long as they come in behind the two weirs. And so that gives us a fair amount of flexibility. This is about 240 degrees that you see here on the back side of these two weirs. So our outlet pipe sits in the little V that's created by the two weirs. So obviously that's about 120 degrees. So we can bring in multiple inlet pipes and we can bring them in at various angles. The other ability that we have with the first offense is because it's the components that actually create the flow pattern, we can actually drop flow in from above, which means, oops, I went too fast there, which means that we can put a grate on the top, and in those applications where perhaps you've got a very small area, or maybe there's one small corner of a site that you need to pick up some treatment on, you can utilize a device with simply a grate and still achieve effective treatment. So again, very easy to design with. Whoops. We currently make 4 different sizes of the device, from 3-foot diameter up to 8-foot diameter. These are various treatment flows that we're able to achieve. NJCAT, I don't know how many folks might be either from New Jersey or even New York or familiar with the NJCAT verification process, because I know there's a lot of areas of the country that tend to use it as a reference. But those flow rates are the ones that are verified through treatment that took place, or pardon me, testing that took place through the NJCAT verification process. The other column you see for 110 micron, that's 110 micron on average is a very common particle size that we see targeted, particularly in areas that maybe don't have prescribed or pre-approved devices that might be on a list of units to select from. Oftentimes, if we're sizing a device in those kind of more flexible applications, then we're targeting a particle size of about 110 micron. And again, this is an area where there's certainly some variety. The finer the particle, the lower your treatment flow rate, and vice versa. So there's a bit of flexibility there. Just a little bit of a highlight of some of the locations where, again, requiring pre-approval of devices and the first offense is in fact accepted for use. And of all of those, probably NJCAT is the most prominent verification agency that we've done testing for. One of the things that, because of the simplicity of design, not only from a design standpoint, it also makes it easy for a contractor to install, because the device actually is pre-assembled at a precast facility, components inside. So when it arrives at a site for a contractor, it's very much like installing any manhole into the ground. So pretty straightforward. Now looking at a separation device, a different separation device, one that we've been making for over 20 years, the Downstream Defender. Just a view of the Downstream Defender. What makes it different primarily from a first offense is that it has no internal bypass. Cutaway view showing the components. Internally, we have this cylinder that is open at the bottom and it's hollow inside. Suspended from the cylinder is a hollow shaft with a cone that actually helps protect this sump area. There's only one flow path through a Downstream Defender, so the water in this case is introduced tangentially to create a rotational flow, and as it's rotating, the only flow path for the water to leave is it has to slip up and underneath the lip of the cylinder and then leave from inside. The outlet pipe actually comes straight through the manhole wall and connects directly to that cylinder. So one single flow path. Because of the underflow here, one, the fact there's no bypass, and two, there's an underflow, not only is it effective at capturing sediment, it's also highly effective at capturing floatable pollutants like oil and trash. Just a little bit of another cutaway view of the basic flow pattern through the unit. Again, tangential inlet sets up a rotational flow, and where the color transitions from that, sort of magenta to blue is where the water would actually move up underneath the cylinder and rotate out through the outlet pipe. So here, with a downstream defender, again, looking at finer particles, as a result, you often get sediment-bound metals with some of those particles, trash and floatables I mentioned, and this is a direct result of the fact there's no internal bypass. Hydrocarbons, so if there are petroleum products that are a concern. And also, we can look at very large drainage areas. We go all the way up to a 12-foot diameter structure with a downstream defender, and flows in the vicinity of 35 CFS that we can actually treat in many cases. So we can look at fairly large drainage areas. So reasons to specify a downstream defender. Solid performance data. We see high flow and a relatively small footprint. I've mentioned the trash and oil capture. The components are specifically designed to minimize washout of sediments, even at higher flows. And the head loss is quite low for the flows that we see. And because there is no internal bypass, it's also effective for operating in either conditions where you have a tailwater on your discharge or even tidal conditions. Again, this particular device has been tested and verified through a whole range of agencies, so just a little snapshot of some of those where it's been approved. The range of the most common sizes from 4 foot up to 10 foot diameter, and peak flows, as you see here. These are typical treatment flow rates listed as water quality flow, but we can take flows all the way up, 3 CFS and a 4, all the way up to 25 CFS and a 10. And then a 12-foot diameter, which we don't, see in a lot of areas, but, there where we've got flow rates in the range of 35 CFS that we can actually treat. Again, I mentioned without an internal bypass, the fact that the device is really effective at capturing floatables, oil in this case, trash, a couple of good pictures of the kind of trash that often gets collected in things like convenience store parking lots where, there's a lot of traffic and unfortunately a lot of trash that gets thrown out, onto the property. So. And again, without an internal bypass, tidal conditions, it's quite effective at dealing with situations where perhaps your outlet pipe could be submerged. So as a result, with only one flow path, we can still effectively treat the discharge in those types of cases where we've got a downstream tailwater. And now lastly, and again, going progressively more stringent in terms of performance, we look at options presented by filtration. We make a filter product known as an Up-Flo filter. The heart of it is a module that contains media bags. And this is a little cutaway of what a module looks like. The media is sandwiched in that module. And as the name implies, these modules are mounted in a structure and flows actually upward through the media before it channels above the media to an outlet. What it allows us to do is, going backwards. What it allows us to do is mount these modules in a variety of different structure shapes. The number of modules that have to be used are very much dependent on the drainage area and in turn the treatment flow rate. One of the major differences between the use of a filter and the use of a separator is that because we're using a physical membrane or media that the water's passing through. The loading rates are much lower than they would be with a separator, and that does, in fact, translate to larger devices because you have to treat your water at a lower rate. So vault designs are not uncommon, and the modules are designed to be bolted together in a way that we can create large treatment areas. So here, with an Up-Flo filter, we're looking at the removal of very fine particles down in the range of, sub 20 micron, industrial materials and things that might result from those types of sites, dissolved metals and particulate metals, which are very common in industrial sites, and certainly nutrients as well, because it's not uncommon for many nutrients to actually attach themselves to extremely fine particles. So in being able to remove that very fine TSS, we're also able to capture a bulk of the metals and nutrients. So, some of the advantages, when you look at an Up-Flo filter, high removal efficiency, easy maintenance, designed specifically to be maintained easily. One of the complexities that comes from a filter system is that obviously now there's a media that has to be changed with some, in some routine schedule, and that media has to be able to be removed fairly readily. So I'll touch on that a little bit. Site flexibility and in turn structural longevity. So just a little snapshot without going into heavy details, but this device, the Up-Flo filter, has been field tested at 3 different sites now at a minimum, and you can see a range of results there. Some of our TARP Tier 2 field testing through NJCAP, we had TSS removal rates up in the range of 98%, and again, extremely fine removals. Metals removal, 70% zinc, copper removal, 88%, in an industrial setting. So, extremely capable in terms of things that are often more difficult to remove. The system designed specifically to really provide 3 different methods of treatment in a single system. There's a level of pre-treatment that results in a settling in the sump, while oils are allowed to float to the surface. Screening, there are screens that act as an initial barrier, as it were, prior to the media in order to keep large debris out of the media itself, and then filtration that takes place through the media upward through the device, as I showed you earlier. Maintenance, as I mentioned, the focus is on making it fairly simple. The modules have little walking lids that can be popped off, and the media bags can be removed from the surface. A spent media bag weighs in the range, while it's wet, of perhaps 40 pounds or so. So generally speaking, can be handled fairly easily. There's a view of what you might see, the difference between a clean new bag and some spent bags that have been removed from a system. So those bags would contain the media. And as I also mentioned earlier, the modules can be outfitted into a variety of structure shapes. For the smallest areas and flow rates that need to be treated, we can actually fit them into a round manhole, and then progressively get larger where we look at vault designs with it using a series of modules. And in the long term, no moving parts. So, and this is true really for all the devices I've shown you, that they're designed for long-term operation and durability. So, they're at least intended to last the life of the structure itself. So, and lastly, I'd like to mention that while much of or all of what I focused on are manufactured systems, we also recognize that there are a variety of natural approaches that can be used, and it's not uncommon that we see our systems used often in conjunction with natural techniques. Certainly the most common, perhaps, is the use of separators as pretreatment devices to, other natural means such as detention ponds or bioswales. But, in many cases, it's very possible and very common to see a combination of manufacturing practices and natural techniques, used in conjunction with one another. And that pretty much wraps it up. As I mentioned earlier, my name is David Monjo. I've actually been over 17 years with the company, so I've seen a variety of things by now. While I focus specifically on the northeastern part of the country, certainly I'm available if any of you might have specific questions you'd like answered. There's my contact information as well in terms of phone number and email address. And the one last thing I would ask in closing is that you will see a survey, and if you wouldn't mind responding to that survey, we would certainly appreciate it. So I thank you for your time this afternoon, and hope you all have an enjoyable 4th next week. Thanks very much. Okay, never share that.